Hey, what's up, New Zealand and the world? Lucas Lawman's Kiwi voice, sitting down again with the man, Mr. Tom O'Connor, fast becoming our resident New Zealand historian, political commentator, etc. Thanks for joining us again, Tom. Really appreciate it. So let's get into some of the Treaty of Waitangi. Tom indicated to me he's got a bit of knowledge around this, the history of these sorts of things, and I would love to hear it, as I'm sure a lot of you would. So let's get into it, Tom. Tell us a bit about the Treaty of Waitangi from your understanding, how it all formed, and a bit of the history behind it.
Well, I think the best way to do that is to debunk a couple of myths.
Sure. Yep.
And one myth is that the Treaty of Waitangi was the founding of New Zealand.
Okay.
But it wasn't. There were European people living in New Zealand for at least 50 years before the Treaty of Waitangi.
Right.
From about 1790 there were Europeans here.
Okay.
And they were welcomed here and taken in by coastal tribes. Yep. By the 1920s there were a significant number of Europeans here. By the 30s, European missionaries were here, and by the mid-30s there was about 1,000 acres under cultivation between a place called Otawhau, which is near modern-day Te Awamutu, and Maunga Tautari, which is Cambridge over on the other side.
Okay.
Along those river valleys was about 1,000 acres under cultivation.
Yep.
There were at least 5 flour mills driven by water, and all of that produce, they were all Maori farms.
Yep.
So they had horses and ploughs and all of that, and all of that produce was potatoes, pumpkins, corn and maize, pork and bacon, all, and flour and wheat, all went down the Waikato River, over a portage into the Manukau Harbour at a little place called Purapura, which is now Waiuku, and up the Manukau Harbour and into Orihanga. So that was to feed European towns. Now, in Auckland at that time, there were at least 3 towns. There was one at Orihanga, one at Tamaki, which is the bottom end of Queen Street, and one at Mission Bay.
Oh, yeah.
And I forget the name of the Mission Bay one.
Okay.
It'll come to me. Further south, there was a township at Chimochu, became New Plymouth. In Wellington Harbour, there were 2. One to the west called Kaiwhanawhana, and one to the east called Petaone, which is today's Petone.
Okay. Yep.
Way at the far north, there was a town at Kororareka, Russell.
Yep.
In the South Island, there was one at Whakatu called Nelson, and in Marlborough there was the beginnings of a town called Waiharakeke, which is now modern-day Blenheim.
Okay. Yep.
They weren't collections of little huts on the beach.
Right.
They were substantial buildings, some prefabricated in the UK and shipped out here. They had butchers and bakers and blacksmiths, newspapers and printing presses.
Right. Yep.
So by 1838 or 1839, the population of New Zealand was about 140,000 people, we think. We don't really know for sure.
Okay. Yep.
But about 140,000 people.
Sure.
About 3,000 of those were Baka, or Europeans. And their children of mixed marriage, which were those days were called half-castes.
Yeah, right.
So New Zealand was well established by 1838, 1839.
Okay.
And at that stage, the Whitefield family's company called the New Zealand Land Company arrived with the intention of establishing a colony here. They didn't particularly want Britain here. They wanted to establish their own colony.
Okay.
By 1839, claimed ownership of about 1 million acres between New Plymouth, Wanganui, Wellington and Nelson.
Right.
Some of those land sales were dubious,
Yeah, okay.
because they were pretty arrogant people.
Yes. Yep.
In the far north, at Kororareka, Europeans had been there for a long time. And for the most part, it was a harmonious relationship. But then we had the arrival of pirates, and not mascara-wearing idiots like you see on TV with Johnny Depp and co.
Actual pirates.
These were real people, and they would make the mongrel mob look like Mother Teresa's tea party. They were seriously dangerous people. Yeah. And the tribal leaders up there said, for want of better terminology, to the missionaries, either you control your Pākehā people or we will.
Right.
And if we will, it's permanent.
Goodness.
Well, there's no chance of recidivism or successful appeal.
Yep.
And the British said, they had a British resident, a guy called Busby, had no authority to do anything. And the British said, we can't do anything because New Zealand is not part of the British Empire. To do that, you have to give us permission to bring British law here.
Yeah, okay.
So there was a long discussion about that. Busby had attempted to establish the United Tribes of New Zealand, and I think about 20 people signed a document. But most Maori knew nothing of it, and if they did, they would have had nothing to do with it. They were fiercely independent tribal people.
Yes.
So that organisation existed on paper alone. It had no weight at all.
Yeah.
So the governor of New South Wales, the colony of New South Wales, sent Lieutenant Hobson over with instructions to form some sort of an agreement with Maori.
You say New South Wales, Australia?
Yeah. It wasn't called Australia then, it was just New South Wales.
Yes.
It was a penal colony.
Okay, yeah.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
So, the assumption is that Hobson wrote the Treaty of Waitangi, but he didn't.
Okay.
It's a replica or a repetition of a template that had been used in the British Empire for about 150 years or longer.
Right.
The most recent one before that was used in West Africa in 1825.
Okay.
Prior to that, and I've got no solid evidence of this, I can't find anything in journals yet, but in talking to people in the States, and I was over there in 2001, an exact replica of that treaty was used with a number of North American Indian tribes before the American Revolution.
Sure. Okay. Yep.
And they all have three things absolutely in common. The first part cedes sovereignty to the Crown. There was no sovereignty to cede to anybody. Sovereignty was an unknown concept in tribal society.
Okay. Yep.
So they invented a word called governorship, translated into Maori kawaratanga.
Okay.
But there was no sovereignty to cede. There was no pan-Maori tribal authority throughout New Zealand in those days, and there still isn't.
Right. Yeah.
They were fiercely tribal people.
Yeah.
The second part guarantees the local people that they can keep everything they own and live as they always have done. Nobody was going to make them slaves, and nobody was going to take things off them. And the government of Britain absolutely meant what they said with that. The land grab wasn't created by the British Crown. The land grab was created by private enterprise.
Right.
They created the problem.
Okay.
The government didn't. The government didn't particularly want massive immigration here.
Yeah. Okay.
They just wanted to bring some control to British subjects living here. That's all they ever wanted to do.
Right. Okay.
The third part of the treaty made everybody in New Zealand a British subject with all the rights and obligations and privileges and protections that go with citizenship.
Okay.
Most people never knew anything about it.
Right.
And most people didn't understand what it meant. But citizenship and the rights of citizenship in 1840, very different to the rights of citizenship today. So if you go back to 1840 and have a look at British society, it was stratified, it was hierarchical. At the top you had the sovereign, then you had royalty and the nobility, then the landed gentry, then the artisans,
Yep.
the tradespeople,
Yep.
butchers, bakers, candlestick makers, blacksmiths, and all of those sorts of people. And underneath them you had the peasantry that made up the bulk of the population. Probably more than 70% were in the peasantry who owned nothing and had absolutely no ability to own anything at all.
Right.
And underneath them, until 1836, they had slaves.
Yeah, okay. Yep.
They were all British subjects. The concept of a partnership with any of those lower strata with the sovereign was absolutely inconceivable.
Yeah, okay.
And the British at the time saw Maori as a peasantry, as an available labour force.
Yes.
Regardless of the fact that they owned the country and they owned the land.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that was tikanga Pākehā. That was the way things were done in the Pākehā world. And to some extent still is. Maori society was equally stratified. So at the top you had Ariki and then Tohunga and Rangatira, and there were significant overlaps. And then Tuatua, and then were common people, and underneath them were Mokai, and underneath them was Taureka was prisoners of war. But their slavery and European slavery, very different things. Mokai were more like retainers and servants,
Okay.
you know.
Yeah.
So putting those two societies together, they didn't dovetail exactly.
Yeah.
They didn't dovetail exactly, and it was unreasonable to expect that they would.
Of course, yeah. Yeah.
And even the missionaries who learned to speak Maori really didn't have a good understanding of Maori society and Maori folklore, and weren't interested in finding out.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
So the Treaty of Waitangi didn't establish, wasn't New Zealand foundation. New Zealand was well founded
Right.
before 1840.
Right. Yeah, and that's a key element that not a lot of people would. I think even some people, if they heard that notion, would dismiss it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Well, that's absolutely. And you know, I don't generate any of this stuff. It's this well-recorded stuff.
Yes.
So it's certainly written down.
Yes.
The interesting thing is, up until 1840, so that for that first 50 odd years, there was no formal government here, and they didn't need it.
No. No.
They used about 3 currencies.
Yep.
They looked after each other, and they dealt with people who broke the rules of society as rural people do.
Yes. Yeah.
But there was no formal government, and they didn't need it. And some of our MPs might like to reflect on that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the real problem happened with the land settlement company, and Maori had no idea of how big the immigration crowd would be. They had no concept of that at all.
Okay.
Eventually, the Whitefield company, after creating all sorts of problems, went broke.
Okay. So when you say the Wakefield Company, it's a...
Yeah, Edward Gibbon Wakefield and all that lot.
Okay.
And his brothers and nephew,
Okay.
and they went home.
Right.
And the fledgling New Zealand government, probably with the best intentions in the world, picked up all their debts and obligations and assets
Right.
and tried to unravel the mess.
Okay.
And we're still doing that.
Yeah, right.
But
Okay.
the government of the day did not create that mess.
Gotcha. That is a key distinction. So more from the British settling side of things, in terms of they had set up a system to a point. I'm trying to simplify things here, I guess, and see if I'm reading you correctly. And then when things weren't going well for them economically, they buggered off and then left the remaining or the existing New Zealand government to try and tidy things up, and that's where the process of treaty settlement began.
They assumed all their roles and responsibilities
Yep.
with the best of intentions, but it was well beyond them. It would be well beyond anybody today to try and, you know, imagine if you had a liquidator trying to sort that mess out.
Yes.
It was an impossible task.
So that's when the treaty was put together and signed. It was at that point, or after that point, when...
Well, Whitefield was here in 39, the treaty was signed in 1840.
Yes.
And the British had the clear intention of putting the brakes on Whitefield and slowing him down and making him conform to stuff and do things correctly. So all the land sales were put in abeyance and investigated, and some were found to be legitimate, most were not.
Yes, yeah, yeah.
But with typical arrogance, until 1840 things were relatively peaceful, but the first real conflict blew up within 3 years of the Treaty of Waitangi.
Right.
In Marlborough.
Yeah, okay.
Now, a renowned chief of Ngāti Toa had taken ownership of most of Marlborough, and Wakefield wanted to buy it, and he attempted to do that by fraudulent means. He sent in the surveyors. Dirupra chased them off, told them to go away, don't come. He didn't want to fight them.
Yeah.
And they came back and put in survey pegs and built little grass huts, and so he pulled the pegs up and burnt the huts.
Yep.
Wakefield attempted to have him arrested and charged with arson.
Right.
And he took a police magistrate, at the time probably just a JP,
Yep.
and 20 odd settlers who had arrived with no land, and they went over armed to the teeth. And in the ensuing gun battle, about 20 Europeans were killed.
Right.
And along with Whitefield and the police magistrate, they were all killed.
Right. Okay.
Quite a few, about a dozen got away,
Yep.
and about 9 Maori were killed as well. It was the first gunfight over land in New Zealand, and the only one in the South Island.
Right. Okay.
A subsequent investigation exonerated Dirupra, said he was entitled to defend himself. The second clash happened in the far north, when the government of the day decided in 1845 to relocate from Russell down to Auckland.
Okay.
And Ngāpuhi saw that as a betrayal.
Right.
Because their intention of having the treaty wasn't just to bring law and order, it gave them access to European technology. So there was axes and shovels and spades, horses and ploughs, seed potatoes, pigs and cattle, literacy and numeracy.
Okay.
And they wanted all of those things.
Yeah.
And they also wanted an end to inter-tribal fighting with muskets, because that was devastating.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yes.
So they had a good working relationship with Parker traders until the pirates arrived and created problems.
Yeah, okay.
Two of the most damaging things that they got from Europeans was Christianity and muskets. They caused equal amount of damage. Christianity unravelled Maori society and replaced it with something that actually didn't work.
Yeah, okay.
And it didn't work for several generations. And muskets, of course, originally as a weapon or as a piece for hunting ducks and pigeons, very quickly become a weapon of war.
Yes.
And the result of that was devastating.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's why that came about.
So you just sort of pick up on the point you're making there about Christianity.
Yeah.
So can you elaborate a little bit more on that? What was the damaging effects of
there was an assumption by the Church Missionary Society and one or two others that they had an absolute obligation to convert these latest newfound heathen savages to Christianity.
Right.
They had this obligation without any idea that Maori people had their own philosophy, their own folklore, and their own social structure, which was equally complex.
Yeah.
And they deliberately unravelled it.
Right.
On the assumption that they were doing what they were supposed to be doing. What they didn't understand was Maori didn't adopt Christianity for about 4 generations. What they did was taking parts of Christianity that suited their own philosophy.
Yeah.
So right up until for the next 25 or 30 years, there were at least 10 different Maori churches established by different people.
Okay. Yeah.
Because some idiot told them way back he thought they were one of the lost tribes in Israel.
Okay, right.
So they took parts out of the Old Testament and melded it in with Maori philosophy.
Oh, goodness.
But most of those church groups didn't last any longer than their founders.
Yeah, okay.
About 3 have.
Right, right.
The last one was in 1935, which was the establishment of the Waitangi Church. They do way more good than harm, and if that's the way they want to go about things, that's fine.
Yeah, yeah.
But it wasn't what Church Missionary Society expected.
So you're saying there really it was because Māori had their own beliefs, their own spiritualism, their own system with all of that, that just it should have been left alone.
Well, why not?
Yes,
It served them well.
Yes, correct.
And it was their business, and it was an absolute arrogance to assume that you could come here and say, well, forget all that and do this.
Yes.
Well, I don't know any other society in the world that's going to do that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
They were lucky to get away without getting their heads knocked off.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, so they did an immense amount of damage in a very short time.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't serve any useful purpose at all.
Yeah, yeah.
So it took away the power of Rangatira, it took away the power and the influence of tohunga, and tohunga weren't wizards or witch doctors, they were experts in all sorts of things.
Yeah.
And Maori society absolutely relied on them.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So to do that to a free living people was a reprehensible thing to do. So that's how that all unfolded. And things thereafter, after the battles of 1845, were relatively peaceful until more and more Europeans were arriving looking for land. Some of them paid for farms and sections that didn't exist. They were dumped on the beach with their possessions, and quite often little kids with nothing, and absolutely no way of going back to England. They were stuck here. And without Maori looking after them, they were starved.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they were taken in, but tensions started to build, and it really came to a head in 1860, when the governor at the time, Thomas Gore Brown, forced the sale, or tried to force the sale of 600 acres at Waitangi, just north of New Plymouth. The local Tautawa said the land's not for sale. We don't want to sell it. New Park has got enough land. We don't want you to have any more.
Yes.
They were still largely hunter-gatherers, needed huge areas of untouched territory to live on. That's the way they were. Gore Brown tricked the young chief into selling his share. He had no tribal right to sell it at all. That blew up into a fight between Tautawa and their own people, to the point that there were a couple of killings. He declared martial law, and the first shots of the New Zealand Land Wars were fired on St Patrick's Day, March 17, 1860.
Wow. Yeah.
That first contest, they were a bit like Putin. He thought it was all going to be over in a week. No, it wasn't. No, it wasn't. And that dragged on for 12 months. It reached a stalemate. Gore Brown was replaced by George Grey for his second term as governor. And the government eventually abandoned the attempt to buy Waitangi. Gave it away. In the meantime, a lot of people had been killed, a lot of farms had been destroyed. Huge resentment had been built up between Maori and Pākehā. During that first contest, the people of Waikato, contrary to the advice of their paramount chief, Te Whenokau, came down and joined in to help Tautawa against the British. Grey saw that as rebellion against the Crown, as he saw the establishment of the first Maori king in 1858, and decided to invade the Waikato. Now that invasion was illegal by today's standards. It was illegal by the standards of the time. It was against British law to do that, and Quay knew it.
Yeah. Okay.
That war lasted until about 1865, and then they did some terrible things. And one of the things he did was have people arrested and held without charge. And one of the people he did that to was sent to the Channel Islands with a whole lot of other people.
Yeah.
And that was Te. And he got away and come back to New Zealand and disappeared into the bush, and they chased him until 1872. So the conflicts that grew from there weren't Maori against Pākehā. It was Maori against Maori, because a lot of Maori people were on the side of the Crown because they were their trading partners, and there were all tribal animosities as well.
Yeah. Okay.
So it was quite a complex situation. But in the middle of 1860, so the war had been going since March, and Gore Brown realised that he was in trouble, and he called a conference of tribal chiefs at Kohimarama, was the name of the town at Mission Bay.
Yeah.
And it took a long time to get all those people together, and they gathered first on the 10th of July 1860. There was 112 of them, but in 2 days' time there were over 200 of tribal chiefs. Whether any came from the South Island, I don't know.
Okay.
I can't find that out.
Yeah.
And he asked them a number of questions. He gave them a whole lot of flannel and bullshit.
Yeah.
But he asked a few questions. Whether they supported the Crown in the war in Taranaki, whether they supported the establishment of a Maori king. And the first king, Whetero, had just died. He was quite an elderly man. He took the name Port Harpen. And his son, Tawhio, took over from him. Whether they supported the establishment of Maori king because Britain didn't want that, and whether they want Britain to stay in New Zealand. Now, a pivotal point, and it was the first of 3 occasions when the British government were on the cusp of abandoning the New Zealand colony. They would have just got home.
Okay. Yeah.
And then he left them to their deliberations. Now, their speeches are well recorded in a Maori newspaper called Te Kairere. I have a number of copies.
Gotcha.
And so they were Maori journalists who were bilingual, but Maori orators didn't have speech notes, and they still don't. But the speeches were well recorded. And after several days of deliberation, they declined to support the Crown in the war in Taranaki. They absolutely supported the establishment of a Maori king, and they wanted the British to stay.
Okay.
Because they wanted one law for everybody.
Right.
They didn't want to be separate.
Yeah.
When they were asked about the Treaty of Waitangi, they said, that is purely a matter for Ngāpuhi, it's got nothing to do with us. So the conference at Kohimarama in 1860 was far more important to Maori than the Treaty of Waitangi.
Gotcha. Wow. Yeah, I mean, and this is the thing, that's why we talk to people like you.
Yeah, so coming out of all, if we want to avoid a clash of people in New Zealand, there's a couple of things that absolutely must happen.
Yeah.
First of all, part of New Zealanders, people like me, have to ignore the extremists and the racists and the idiots, and listen honestly to the story Maori have been trying to tell them for a very long time. And it's not a pretty story. I mean, if you have a look at what's happening in the Ukraine right now, that happened here in 1860. They didn't have jet fighters, they didn't have war tanks and bombs and guided missiles. They had 18,000 of the best infantry in Europe. Now, I know Professor Bellich speaks disparagingly of the British soldiers in New Zealand. I disagree. Britain hadn't dominated 2/3 of the world with an inadequate army. And most of these guys had just come out of India dealing with what was called the Indian Uprising, and that was a shockingly atrocious story. So they were hardened British infantry. They were up against, at the most, 5,500 to 6,000 Maori armed with old shotguns and not much else. So the British Army acted pretty much as the Russians are acting in Ukraine right now. They destroyed farms, they destroyed all the agriculture in the central Waikato, including the flour mills. I found the wreckage of two.
Wow.
Excuse me. They killed non-combatants, old people, women and children, and there's a number of well-recorded examples of that. On one terrible occasion, a militia cavalry group came across a group of kids out hunting. I think they were hunting ducks or pukaka or something like that, and they rode them down and killed them.
Yeah, right.
And the leader of that was a guy called Bryce. Then, during the last phases of the war in Waikato, they came across a huge park called Pātarangi. It still exists. And behind Pātarangi was a township called Raiahia, built by Maori missionaries as a centre of agriculture. And the Maori were told by the missionaries to get the non-combatants, women and children, out of Pātarangi into safe haven. So they went to that township.
Yeah.
In the night, General Cameron took his troops around Waitangi and attacked Raiahia in the morning. Killed about 30 people. A lot of them were killed in a church that they set alight.
Right, right.
So I think that was New Zealand's first mass murder.
Yeah, okay.
So are Maori entitled to recompense? Absolutely, without question. They are entitled to recompense and compensation and recognition by way of equity to bring them to a level where they would have been or should have been if they had not been dispossessed. That recognition and recompense must never include the creation of a privileged class of citizens.
Yeah, right.
That would be absolutely dangerously wrong to do.
Yeah.
And that's where we're heading.
Gotcha. See, that's where you think we're going too far in the other direction.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. So that's
and it's unnecessary and unwarranted.
Yes.
For their part, Maori have to also listen to the story that Pākehā tried to tell. And they have to accept that people like me are tangata whenua Pākehā. We are natives of this land. We are not British. Not that there's anything wrong with being British.
I understand what you're saying there. Yeah.
And in spite of my name and my short stature and sometimes unconscious nature, I'm not an Irishman.
Yeah.
We belong nowhere else in the world.
Yeah.
And we can only ever be equal in all things. And equality in all things is a very, very simple concept. It's only made complex by people with a political agenda. And that's when I come back to the point I made last time I spoke to you, that democracy is vulnerable and delicate and can be distorted.
Yes. Yeah.
And if you do that, you create serious issues for everybody. And we don't want it, and we don't need it, and it's unnecessary.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean to say that if I wear the title of tangata whenua Pākehā, and I do on the marae many, many times, and I've never been challenged, that doesn't take that title away from anybody. It doesn't dilute it for anybody. And it doesn't take away the right of tangata whenua Māori to seek recompense and compensation for the shocking things that happened to them during the colonial era. We didn't do it. Pākehā today accept the moral responsibility to see that justice is done. But in accepting that moral responsibility, they're not accepting the blame or the culpability. Two very different issues.
Yeah, for sure.
And I get frustrated and annoyed when Maori academics and some Maori politicians say, well, you Pākehās did this and you Pākehās did that. No, we didn't. We didn't rob anybody.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah.
So we are as much victims of the colonial era as anybody else because we get the blame for things we didn't do. Okay, well, the treaty is relevant and important only so far as it was the catalyst for the establishment of British law.
Yeah.
Thereafter, New Zealand law has evolved from British law.
Gotcha. Yeah.
There's a move now that suggests that there's an ongoing permanent partnership stemming from the Treaty of Waitangi in the governance of the country.
Okay. Yeah.
It's a dangerous myth.
Yes.
There's nothing in the Treaty of Waitangi at all, in the Maori version or the English version, and I can read both, that suggests there was anything like that ever contemplated.
Yeah, gotcha.
And Britain had never shared sovereignty with anybody over 700 years of colonialism. In fact, they'd fought a number of brutal, bloody wars to ensure that they did not share sovereignty with anybody.
Yeah, okay.
So the partnership has come from a throwaway comment from a High Court judge in 1986 over a land case. It's been picked up and misused. But the parties to a treaty or the parties to a contract or a memorandum of understanding are only partners thereafter if the document says so. And the treaty does not say that, and it never intended to do that. And Maori right up and even after 1860 did not want separatism.
Yep.
And where separatism was allowed to develop in other countries, and the North American Indians, they insisted on living on their own land, in their own way, under British law, but left alone. And it was called today self-determination, which can mean almost anything you like.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
The result of that in North America was North American Indians living in abject poverty on Indian reservations, and they are still there.
Yes, they are. Yeah, exactly.
In Africa, the same thing happened, and that eventually evolved into apartheid. In New Zealand, Maori didn't want that to happen.
Yeah.
So after the end of the land wars, Maori said, okay, if we are to be British subjects, we want seats in our parliament. Why can't we stand for parliament? It was a fair question.
Yeah.
In those days, following the British system, the only people who could stand for election to the parliament and be involved in elections were people who owned land over a certain value.
Yep. Yep.
So of the 130 or 40,000 people in New Zealand, only about 600 could stand for parliament and be electors, and all of those were immigrant entrepreneurs and investors. Maori said, that's wrong, that's unfair.
Yep.
And they appealed to Britain, and the Colonial Secretary, Lord, I forget, gave a clear instruction to New Zealand Parliament that they had to allow for a Maori franchise. So, rather than give all Maori the vote, or all Maori men over 21 the vote, they knew that that would result in a completely Maori parliament. And those investors and entrepreneurs did not want that to happen. It should have happened, and it could have happened. They did not want that to happen. So they created 4 Maori seats. So they could corral and fence in the Maori vote. And they made those seats on largely tribal affiliation lines on the assumption that those members of Parliament wouldn't work together because of tribal affiliation. Well, they got that terribly wrong. They did work together.
Yeah, gotcha.
So that was in 1867. Women didn't get the vote until 1893.
Right.
The original purpose for the Maori seats has long disappeared. But the fate of those seats, I believe, must be decided by Maori alone. If they're not doing any good, they're not doing any harm, leave them there. But as long as Maori wants them, but there are more Maori parliaments in general seats than in the Maori seats. But if they want to keep them, let them keep them. I don't have a difficulty with that.
Yeah, I understand.
But that's where they came from.
Yes.
So
Yeah, I didn't realise it. Yeah.
Yeah, so where we're going now is moving again to separatism, and I have to be generous and say I don't think it's dishonest and I don't think it's sinister, but I think it's shockingly ill-informed.
Yeah, gotcha.
Shockingly ill-informed.
Yeah, I think, Tom, that is probably a really good point to finish on. And yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time to yarn with us again and let me know all about. I mean, it's been an awesome personal learning experience for me. I've really enjoyed listening to you lay that all out. And as you said, we could do this all afternoon pretty easily.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Can I just finish on a note?
Yes.
That we must not let people with political agendas divide us.
Yep.
We don't have to be like each other.
Yes.
We are not.
Yeah, respect each other's differences.
But you have to treat each other with the utmost courtesy and respect.
Mm-hmm.
That's Maori Parliament together.
Yep.
If we allow that wedge of division to be driven into society, you're driving through the middle of my family.
Mm-hmm.
Because more than 2/3 of my family, my extended family, are Maori.
Yes. Yep.
You know, so we have to stop the name calling and the ill-informed racist comments. We have to call that out for what it is.
Yep. Yep.
And we have to shame those people because they should not be doing that.
Yep.
It's absolutely unhelpful to do that.
Yes. Yep. Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more on that front. Awesome to finish actually on a point of unity. Thanks everyone once again for tuning in. It has been awesome catching up with Tom and learning all about the history of the Treaty of Waitangi, and I'm sure we'll probably converse again in the near future. So keep an eye on the page for that. Hit that like button and subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube. But again, comment down below as per usual. We'd like to get into the discussion. We'll leave it there for now, but for now, team, stay safe, stay free, and we'll see you again real soon. Thanks, Tom. That was awesome.
Good.
Excellent. Really, really cool. Really enjoyed it.